Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Imperial British podcast. I'm sorry it's been a while since I've done one of these. I will just tell you honestly that I did not want to do one. It takes a while to record, I have to edit these, but I enjoyed making it, and this is a topic that I really wanted to cover. I think it's good for people to know this now and in the future. So I am going to be going through the entire history of CSA and EBI. Now, I can't go as in-depth as I would like, and I should probably have Omega on as a guest, and maybe in the future we could discuss it more in detail, but I just wanted this as a basic video that we could watch in the future to explain this to anyone that may not understand. And so I'm going to walk you through the first leader to the 7th, and then from the beginning of the Omega era to where we are now. Before we begin, I want to preface with a couple of things. First of all, because we're just starting this, I'm definitely having some issues with setup. I don't know the best place to have my microphone or what's going to make too much background noise. So if you hear my mouse moving and clicking or creaking of my chair, I apologize. Hopefully in the future I'll find a better way to do all of this and we can get that figured out. But for now, we're going to deal with it. I'll maybe put some music in the background and hopefully that'll cover up a lot of it. But yeah, I'm excited to get into this topic. I don't have any pictures for this one. I probably should have made some, but I figured most of you were just going to listen to this anyway. Maybe in the future we'll add some pictures just that can slide through just as something more visually appealing. But that is all I had to begin, so I want to go ahead and get into this topic of the history of CSA and EBI. So, as we begin, the first person to cover is the first leader of CSA, Fireman 3333. Unfortunately, we don't really know a ton about this era of CSA history. It was ages ago. 2009 is when the group was created. And so because of that, wall posts have been lost, especially with the ban of CSA, but many of you know we went through a purge where many of our members were exiled and wall posts were deleted, and so we lost a lot of that history, but we do have some of it written down. The wall posts from CSA a long time ago do clarify that Fireman was probably in a CSA group before our CSA existed, but was just unhappy with the way it was run. So he decided to make his own, and this was not uncommon. War groups in 2009 on Roblox, even war groups now, typically tend to be not taken too seriously, and there's no group loyalty. And so we see that come through with the creation of new groups, and we see that now. But back then it was even worse. The groups never got as big as we are now. Groups never even got to as big as CSA was when it got banned. Most groups only had a couple hundred members. Thousands were... If you had 1,000 members, you were a large, large clan. So new groups being created when you're dissatisfied with the conduct of another is not uncommon. And we know this, it's further backed by the fact that the first wall post in CSA was a post that said, quote, "Welcome to the new reformed group." This era didn't see a lot of growth. And when I say growth in this podcast, I should point out, I don't mean growth like we experienced in CSA in our time. Not growth into the thousands, from 1,000 to 8,000, what we had at the end. I mean growth in the tens or the hundreds. When Omega took over, I think CSA only had 450 people. So when I say growth, I'm meaning in the tens, literally. So this is certainly not a massive change in group numbers. I'm talking more about the slow stabilization and creation of what eventually became CSA. In Fireman's era, that growth was pretty slow. And the reason for that really is because of how war groups were at that time. The fact is, the standards for forts, for tech that they used, for promotions and ranks and leaders, all of that was really, really low. Nothing was ever official. The wars weren't very official. It was just kind of skirmishing with random, union groups. It really was not a great setup. Because of that, Fireman is known as, of course, the creator of the group, and at the time of his creation, he didn't cause any problems. It just was not a period of extreme growth. But sometime in 2011, after about 2 years, Fireman decided to retire. Obviously, 2 years running a group is actually pretty impressive, especially with 2009 to 11 Roblox. Certainly it was long-lived even at that point. But Fireman did retire and gave the group to Ryboy 95, the second era, the Ryboy era. And we generally call them the era of the leader who was commanding at that time. So there was the Fireman era, and then the Ryboy era followed that. Ryboy 95 led an era that was considered by many older members to be their favorite. It was a period of growth for CSA. Again, not a large growth, but steady growth, and that's what was important back then. Raboy really attempted to modernize the groups. He created several, I guess you could say, branches of EBI. I'm gonna say that a lot. I mean CSA. If I say EBI and I don't correct myself, just fill it in on your own. I'm sure you know what I mean. I'm so used to EBI now. What I should say is that he created many subgroups for CSA. Specifically, the Watchers, the military police, which was a following on the Watchers, and he was also the creator of the Coalitionist Senate, which many of you know from CSA. We had that. That's what the officers were members of in CSA before it was banned. So I think it's important to discuss what those were and to give you kind of an overview of what they would have done. And so we're going to break off from Raboy to talk about some of the things that he created. The first group he created was called the Watchers. They acted sort of as what you might call a secret police. Unfortunately, they're not very effective because they have uniforms that distinctly show who they are. They're intermingling with the people. People know what group they're in. They weren't an effective spy organization. And essentially what happened with them is they were supposed to deal with subversive activity in CSA. They were supposed to deal with people who were trying to hurt CSA from the inside. Unfortunately, they only had a chain of command in the Watchers. They didn't listen to the officers of CSA. They had to listen to the Watcher officers who were from CSA, but it's its own separate thing. So there were Watchers, and then there was the commander of those Watchers, the captain, and then there was the general, who was Raboy. Which meant that there was no one to keep them in check. And this was very, very clear to the members of CSA at the time. They were well known for admin abuse, for openly killing CSA members when team kill was still a thing, without getting in trouble. They just didn't get punished. And so they weren't very loved. And essentially, they weren't very effective. There was really nothing for them to do. Spies have always been kind of pointless in Roblox groups. It just doesn't work. And so, for them to find out spies was a great thing to weed out those spies, and I'm sure that was useful at the time, but it just wasn't enough to be a useful group. That should be something that one or two people do. It's not really effective for a whole group in CSA. Anyway, they were disbanded after only a few months, and you can see why. People didn't like them, they had problems with the chain of command, with the amount of power they held, and that was made clear, and they were disbanded. But, Raboy also decided that it was important that there were some organization to deal with those who might subvert the ideals of CSA or spies in the group. And to do this, he created the military police. Now, many people did protest this creation, because probably exactly what you're thinking. Raboy created the Watchers. Why would the military police be any different? And that's exactly what everyone thought. They expected the same admin abuse, they expected the same team killing, and they expected the same of essentially never being held accountable for their actions. But fortunately, Raboy did manage to learn from his errors, and those mistakes did seem to be fixed at least somewhat. The operations of the military police were controlled by officers of the main group, which meant they were held accountable, and they also were not allowed to team kill flippantly because they could be punished for those actions. So, despite the fact that their operation in the group wasn't really despised by the people, it was just useless. As I said, there's really no use for spy organizations. So the military police did exist for a long time. They took over from where the Watchers left off, and they existed until Omega took over CSA. But essentially at that point he realized that they were just taking up more resources than was necessary, shut them down, and just moved everyone into infantry or the branches that we had at that point. And that was what happened with Raboy's two creations of subgroups, I suppose you could say. But, to continue with Raboy, the most important thing that he created was the Coalitionist Senate. As I said, that's something we even had in CSA before it was banned. It was essentially an advisory board to Omega of officers. We suggested ideas, it's where we decide our training days, and it's now turned into the Privy Council in EBI, which is just a more accurate thing to Britain than CSA. So this is obviously something very important and very integral to the group, even to nowadays. Raboy is the one that created that. They weren't, and it's the same as now. Roblox, it's impossible to be a democracy. We can't have a parliament that's going to really make the laws of the group. We're going to make a parliament soon in EBI, and hopefully we will be able to make laws and pass them and vote, but essentially, Omega is always going to be in control. That's how it is. or at least whoever owns the group in the future, but currently it is Omega. So the Coalitionist Senate did not have a lot of power, but they were an advisory board, and that was important because someone else's opinion was being heard. Raboy also known for being the first to persecute CSA heresies. That's mainly because of the fact that at this point, CSA had solidified itself. With Fireman, even under the 2 years that he was there, it's as I said at the beginning of the podcast, groups split up all the time. I mean, it was extremely common. But now we've had a group for 3 years at this point, and it's still going strong. And so Raboy realized, we've got something good here, and others can ruin that by making their own groups. And so he began to persecute those heresies, outlawing members of CSA making their own groups or their own CSAs specifically. And that turned out to be very important as well, because it did allow us to continue to thrive into the future. Although not every group, obviously, or every leader held to that, it does seem to be an important decision that he made. So overall, Raboy was a pretty effective era. It's considered to be a major part of the foundation of what we have modern days. A lot of what Raboy did was removed in the 4th, 5th, and 6th eras, and was brought back by Omega. So it's certainly a very important part of our history. The next person that we're going to talk about is the one who Raboy gave CSA to upon retiring, and that was Jake the Bowslayer. I always say Jake the Bowslayer. I'm sure that's not right, but either way, I'm not going to penalize you for it, but I think it's Jake the Bowslayer. Jake the Bowslayer was pretty competent. This is called the Jake era, very aptly named. He was fairly successful in fighting Union groups, but unfortunately, there's not much of note that happened. And this is kind of how it is. People always remember the faults of leaders, but when they do things just on a normal... If it's not great or terrible, it often gets overlooked. And that's what happened with Jake. Jake had a very consistent leadership, but nothing insane happened in either direction. Nothing too terrible and nothing too great. And so not much is written down, but we do know it was a stable era for CSA. One thing that we do have to note is that it's believed that the Coalitionist Senate really began to increase its power under Jake. It became less of an advisory board and more into the role it had in recent times, which is actually being able to propose ideas to Omega. Of course, the leader is still going to make the decisions. Jake, at this point, still made the final decision. But at least they were able to propose that and not just advise him on, smaller matters. So Jake did retire a successful leader, and that's really all that I've heard of him. I'm sure Jake has come back on and said other things, but all I've heard of Jake is that he had a successful reign. It was not extremely long, but it was successful while he had it, and that was it. Jake retired, and the group went to new Mr. Boom. And this is where things start to feel like a soap opera. I love CSA. I joined it after all of this happened. And to me, it seems like squabbling over something that's just so strange, fighting over a Roblox troop like this. But then I know how devoted I've become to CSA and now EBI, and I realize that I understand why it's happening. But really, once you hit new Mr. Boom, things get really, really hairy pretty quickly. So new Mr. Boom was the 4th leader in CSA, the 4th era as well, the Boom era, as you would probably assume. And this era began in October of 2012. We don't know the specific date, but around that time. Initially, things were pretty slow. One of the things that Jake did do in his last days was make peace with most of the recognized Union groups. Because at this point, 2012, CSA has been around for a while, as have some unions that have emerged as the frontrunners in recognized Union groups. We were the recognized Confederate group, although there were some heresies, and the Union had multiple different branches and groups that we ended up fighting with, but Jake made peace with them. However, this seemed to be pretty short-lasted, because as Boom took over, the Senate voted to end the peace. This is because a Union leader named Sammy1229 said that Jake had actually not just made peace, but surrendered to the Union Army, and that they had won the war. Of course, as you would expect, the CSA Senate was spurred by this and voted to, and of course was approved by new Mr. Boom, fight the Union again. And so the wars began again, and they kept going until we get into the Omega era. But something else important did happen under new Mr. Boom. Sometime into 2013, a brigadier general named Nuclear Sombrero gained control over the largest colonial British group at the time. They were called the British Dominion. You can still find their group now. I looked them up. 400 or so members, pretty small, definitely not active. No updates. They still have a forum link on their wall, which you can certainly use that to tell if the group is old. But at the time, a well-known colonial British group, and Nuclear had a belief. That belief was that he was being held back in his progression through the ranks of CSA, specifically because of Major General at the time, Omega Invictus. As I said, Nuclear was a Brigadier General, so he was under Omega at the time, and his essential thought, I assume, was just, I could get that next spot if Omega wasn't there. So, having command of this British group, he essentially demanded that Omega retire. Now, Omega did refuse, and that led to Nuclear declaring war on the CSA with his British group. Certainly not period correct or historically accurate. Thank goodness, that would have been a lot quicker of a war than the real Civil War was. That would have been over in a second. But nonetheless, it happened with our CSA. Unfortunately, it's not much for storytelling because it ended within a couple of days. There's actually only one raid. It was at CSA HQ, where the British group lost fairly handily, and they pretty much quit after that. So not much in the way of storytelling or drama, but it did bring about one of the most dramatic things that's happened in CSA that I think is absolutely insane that it got this bad. And you'll see what happened is that after this war, Fireman came back, having retired, as I said, in 2011. It's 2015 now. Or 2013 now, I apologize. And so this is like a 2-year difference. But Fireman came back and became involved with CSA again. And that is going to lead us into one of my favorite parts of CSA history, which is the political parties. And they are a major part of our story today. So, speaking of political parties, there were 2. First, there was the... Well, actually, before I tell you what they were, let me tell you why they were created. So, essentially, despite CSA being relatively successful in this time in 2013, that success was based on what war groups thought was successful at the time. That's what I just said earlier. It's the fact that the members at that time, the steady growth I told you about, only led them to a couple hundred people. Essentially, the way CSA was led was what is called the spoils system. And I know my accent is strong, the spoils system, if you can understand me. And a spoils system is essentially where someone in a position of power gives subordinate positions to his friends or people that he knows or owes things to, rather than those who deserve that position based on merit. Now, this is pretty common in Roblox groups. I think most of you have probably even owned a group or two where you've made your friends high ranks. It's just how it works. But it's not effective for a good Roblox war group. It just doesn't work. Eventually, probably pretty quickly, someone's going to be given a high rank position who doesn't care, who just wanted it because they wanted to be in power, and they're going to ruin it for everyone. And so some people in CSA realized that this was a bad system, and that created contention between some of those members of CSA. Many thought their rank should be based on merit, many thought it should stay the way it was, and eventually that caused 2 parties, the Coalitionists and the Jacksonians. So, the 2 parties were created based on those different ideas of promotions from the members of the group. And as Fireman got more active once again, he saw that Omega held a lot of power in those revolutionary ideas of not giving ranks just to friends, but rather based on the actual skills of the person in question. So, that created, or leads us to, the Coalitionist Party, dedicated to fighting the CSA spoils system. The party held meetings, had a hierarchy, a leader, and a real system of running, and it was official. Of course, not maybe recognized, but it was a real party that had much support from many of the members of CSA. On the flip side, there was the Jacksonian Party, created after the Coalitionists to oppose them. It was much less organized than the Coalitionist Party, simply made not with the idea of being a party, but really just opposing another party, and that's why they weren't as organized. But, despite the fact that they weren't as organized, many of the people in high command in CSA were Jacksonians. And you might wonder why that is. Well, I'll tell you, it's pretty simple. If you're in a position of power, that's been given to you only because your friend is in a higher position of power and you didn't do anything to deserve that. When someone says, hey, you probably shouldn't have this position of power because, you didn't earn it, you might think, I don't know if I agree with that. That's what happened here. Some of the members of CSA who had earned their ranks thought this may not be fair, and the ones who hadn't earned their ranks thought, no, I think it is. And so, the drama begins. Because the people in power were in the coalitionist or in the Jacksonian party, they often banded together and had the same ideals. But the coalitionist party did still grow stronger. Many members had not been free ranked, and they sided with Omega in that party. And Fireman realized eventually that things were changing quickly, and he did not want that change. So he organized a plan. Again, when I told you this is like a soap opera, it feels like a drama TV show. He organized a plan to get Omega out of CSA. So Fireman, New Mr. Boom, who is the leader at the time, Irish Love, and Ranger Rocks, who we'll talk about in just a little bit of time, all supported getting rid of Omega because they saw him and his party as a threat. But Omega also had his side, which included people, some of whom you may have heard of, Polar Beats, USA Invictus, some higher-ups in the group at the time. Fireman created this plan, and what it was is that they were going to tell people that Omega and Nuclear, who is the one I talked about earlier, who took over a British group and raided CSA, had actually conspired to take CSA down from the inside. This is crazy. I cannot believe that this happened at some point. Now, unfortunately for the Jacksonians at the time, that was the plan. That was it. That was all they thought of. Which meant that they did not have any proof. Because it was false. And so, when they posted on the wall, Omega is a suspected traitor and he's going to be removed, and the reason they were accusing him of that, when some of those officers demanded proof, it was obviously not able to be given. In fact, there was only one piece of proof, and it was against them. Nuclear quit Roblox before Fireman had accused Omega of conspiring with him. So essentially, Nuclear wasn't even on Roblox at the time they said this happened. Of course, this is obviously very false, and it created a lot of contention with the members of CSA. You see, Omega and a lot of his members had been removed at this point. But there was no evidence against them. People were getting angry. It looked really bad. And Boom realized that the plan had failed. He reinstated their positions and made an apology. And he did state later on, after writing about this issue, that he was, at the time, sorry about what had happened, and he realized that Fireman had swayed him. And so he did apologize about that, but it happened. Luckily, Omega got back in. Certainly things would be different now. I doubt CSA would still exist if Omega had not. But that leads us to the end of the 4th era of CSA, and into the 5th, the Ranger era. I mentioned a few minutes ago Irish Love and Ranger Rocks. The reason you're going to hear about them is because they are both the next two leaders. The first of which is Ranger. The Ranger era began in late 2013 after New Mr. Boom retired. The reason he retired was the scandal. I think he realized at that point that he had really set himself up for a bad time. He looked really bad, and it was time to get out. So he did. He retired and gave it to Ranger Rocks. As you'll know, Ranger was someone who had supported getting rid of Omega. Obviously, the relationships weren't going to be very chummy from the get-go. This scandal, which of course, although proved false, did make Omega look bad, along with the transfer of the group to a Jacksonian, essentially empowered that party, to the Jacksonian party, and Fireman, along with it, to enter into a months-long feud with the Coalitionist Party. Now, they had already been feuding for a long time, but this is where it really became a well-recognized CSA feud. And this was a tense time for CSA. Roblox groups have died for much less than this. It's not uncommon for a leader of a Roblox group to decide, you know what, I'm done with this. Exile everyone, and be gone. But, thankfully, that didn't happen here. And so, although it was tense, Ranger realized that he was technically the leader and he needed to be impartial. At least as impartial as he could be. So, although he supported that Boom era scandal, he wanted to try and be a middleman for the two feuding parties. And this was the cause of the creation of the Big Three system. Uh, Essentially, the leaders of each party, which was Omega for the Coalitionists, and Irish Love, who you just heard about, for the Jacksonians. And Ranger was the third in the Big Three because he was the General-in-Chief at the time. They all met, and the goal was that they would meet together and decide on issues of the group. The two parties would be represented, along with the leader. They could make fair decisions, and everything would be happy. You'll also notice the Coalitionist Senate is really not making an appearance at this point. They really were not in a position of power. As I said, the 4th, 5th, and 6th era really saw the downfall of the Senate. Now, as I said, this was made to placate Omega, really. The Jacksonians were happy with the leadership that they had. This was made essentially to make the Coalitionists have a stronger trust of the Confederate government, and to make Omega stop being a thorn in their side, really, is the best I can say. But unfortunately, Omega was only ever invited to one meeting of the Big Three of the many that they had. So the Big Three was really only ever two Jacksonians meeting to decide on Confederate issues. Obviously, this strained their relationship even further, and caused a worse divide than what had happened before. That plan of mediation looked good for Ranger initially, and it did make him look good. But the problem is, he eventually publicly stated that he was a Jacksonian, and although most people knew, I mean, it was pretty clear, this also isn't a real-life army, you know? There's not these systems of information that are spreading around everyone. A lot of people weren't up to date all the time. And so some may not have known until he officially announced it. So, announcing he was a Jacksonian, excluding Omega, being a part of the scandal that had made Boom retire, his support fell off. And eventually he fell into activity and then transferred the group to the leader of the Jacksonian Party, who we've talked about multiple times already, Irish Love. And this transfer meant that Omega, who was the leader of the opposing party, with the way that the Big Three was supposed to work, essentially became the second command of the group after that. And so the Ranger era, overall, a very tense time, but in the grand scheme of things, I would say it wasn't very eventful. There was tension, but nothing really happened. It just bowled over, Ranger retired, and Irish took over. So it was certainly tense, and it could have been very bad, but overall I would say it was just a lot of nothing. With our next topic leading into the 6th era, the Irish era, we're going to get into a little bit of a period of inactivity, and then the Omega era will be where we really talk about what's happened recently. So the 6th era in CSA was the Irish era. Irish Love was the leader. His reign was short and turbulent, and that's really all I have to say. Irish is a good guy. I've talked to him before. He seems very nice, but just at the time, the leadership was not the best that it could have been. He pretty quickly outlawed coalitionist activities in CSA. Obviously, many people were coalitionists in the CSA. It wasn't that everyone was a Jacksonian. It was simply the high command. So a lot of people got really angry over this. And in doing this, the second command rank was also disestablished because the position had been filled by Omega. And essentially, he took over control for himself for a very short time. And the coalitionists got really angry. And when one group of people is oppressed against and then gets really angry, what happens next? Well, you might be able to expect the coalitionists began to plan a revolution. I really wish this would have happened, because I'm fairly confident that most of the group would have turned against the Jacksonians. But it never did, because Irish realized, I assume, what was going on, realized what was best for him at the time, abdicated his position just a few months after taking over, and gave the group to Omega on September 3rd, 2013. This made the coalition the major party in CSA, and really the only party in CSA from that point on, but it still existed for a bit longer, the Jacksonian party, I should say. But September 3rd, 2013 began the 7th and current era of CSA, of course now EBI, although we're continuing the eras. The Omega era. Certainly most of you will know this one the best. The most that I can say about it in the short words before we get into the details of it is that it is the most successful time in CSA history. The growth that has been seen is unprecedented, and I highly doubt that had the Jacksonians continued to control the group we would be anywhere close to this today. In fact, the odds are, if the Jacksonians had continued to control CSA, CSA would probably be an abandoned group, and all of us would be playing Adopt Me. But thankfully, that isn't what is happening. So we're going to discuss the 7th era of CSA, the Omega era. So, the first few months, I would say, of the Omega era were very active. Of course, with a new leader who's coming on regularly, that's going to spur people into activity. And so it was very active and very successful. The growth was still sort of slow. This was 2013, and so it was not, as I said, it wasn't a large growth that you wouldn't even expect that. It wasn't like CSA was failing as a group. They were doing well with their growth. It's just that groups didn't grow as fast as they do now. So when he took over, the growth, he started at about 450 members and slowly began to climb. And the earliest part of that era was unfortunately, I guess I would say, marred by the fact that once again, Fireman decided to return to stir up just a little bit of unrest. It was getting a little too boring, a little too successful, and somebody had to come in and mess things up. This time, that's Fireman. Essentially claimed that Omega had wrongly been given CSA and demanded that he step down. I'm sure you can imagine that the answer to this was a quick no. Because, and let me tell you all about this in case you ever think you're going to rebel against a group in Roblox or things along that line. If the leader of the group has any sense or any intelligence even, maybe, just a little bit, he'll just say no. Because all that you have as a recourse after that is to make an entirely new group and try and start it from scratch. Otherwise, there's no way to get someone to change ownership of a group. That's not how it works. You can't vote them out. They own the group. So this was really pointless. But Fireman did it anyway, and a little bit of discontent was stirred, but honestly, I think at this point, Fireman had caused his fair share of problems, and people kind of tuned him out. But it did cause a little bit of brewing trouble that I would say blew up in the future with a problem that we'll talk about very soon. Before we get to that, though, we want to talk about the Republic of Texas. A man named Gut Bomber, great name, really great name, and owned a Republic of Texas group that declared a, quote, War of Texan Independence on CSA. In fact, it was the second War of Texan Independence. I don't know if that's simply the actual first War of Texan Independence, which was... I'm not sure if there was a first one in CSA or CSA. I don't really know. If there is, maybe I'll add an addendum to this video when I get the knowledge about that. But I'm going to say for this, just calling it the War of Texan Independence will be fine. So, in this war, the Republic of Texas group launched a surprise attack on CSA led by Kevin3224. Many of you will probably know him as Kevin Invictus. He's been around for a long, long time. It was very late at night. It was a surprise attack. They hadn't discussed it. And the Texans pretty handily won. The reason for this is because the Texans came on a smaller force of Confederates. The Confederates weren't expecting them. And the Confederates didn't have any extremely skilled players there to defend them. Because generally, even with just a couple people, the Confederates would win because they had the better players. But none of them were on, and the Texans did win that battle. This gave the Texans confidence. They thought, oh, we beat them before. You know, we beat them at midnight one time when 6 people were on. Let's just have a war with them. And so before Omega could come on the next day and declare war on them, the Texans did it themselves. So Omega got on, realized what had happened, and made a pretty bold declaration. He said that, and this was, I think, very close to the start of December. This was not a long, this was not very far away from December. It may have been November of 2013. He announced that by Christmas Day 2013, the war would be over, and that CSA would have won. And after that, the war began in full. A very bold declaration, but it was worth it. It was worth a try to see how CSA did. I think Omega was pretty confident in the fact that the Texans really weren't that well prepared. They simply had won one battle and got a little overconfident. So, it was decided that the first group to hit 10 wins would win the war. So they did their own little skirmishes, and every time you had the most kills or held the fort for the longest in those skirmishes, you got 1 point, and the first team to get 10 points or 10 wins was the winner of the war. CSA pretty quickly began to roll out and beat Texas again and again and again. And they eventually began to raid the Texans at their fort, which was called Fort Alamo. But as CSA has dealt with in the past, or maybe this was the first time, and it allowed us to be prepared for it in the future, those raids slowly became harder and harder because the groups slowly became more and more unfair. For an example of that, the Texans would change the amount of time required to hold the flag to win, making it longer and longer and longer. Or even plug up entrances to their fort. Some of the gates that should have been allowed to go through to capture that flag may have been covered up or bricked over, obviously making it a little bit harder, but eventually the Confederates still won. They still won. The Texans rigged it, and the Confederates won. That shows you what CSA can do. And that continued as a trend until 2019 when they were banned, and now into EBI. But, as I said, CSA won. In fact, they won on December 15th, 2013, 10 days before the deadline that Omega gave. So obviously, even he was not correctly timing how long that war would take because it was 10 days shorter than he thought. Anyway, there was a short period of Confederate stability. Wars had been won, people were feeling good. And then Fireman's insurrection began to steamroll into something even worse. Now, Fireman was not directly in charge of this. I'm not saying that he was. But he did lead into a lot of anti-Omega sentiment, which led into the Southern Renegades, the Jacksonian Southern Renegades. Many of you have heard of them because we've talked about them before in the Discord, but it's a very important part of CSA's history, even if it isn't really that big of a deal. I say that because the fact stays the same as what I said for rebellions earlier. They could not have won. It's not how it works. But they did cause a lot of unrest. So, after that war, Major General Cool Rolling Stones was demoted by the Senate because he was inactive. This happened in 2014, so a little bit after the War of Texan Independence, into the next year, he was demoted. And after being demoted, a week later, he ended up just resigning his post altogether, leaving CSA entirely, assuming out of anger because of that, and joined a group called the Southern Renegades, which was led by the Jacksonians, and began a policy of hostility to CSA for a pretty long period of time. 2014 proceeded mainly as normal, but trouble still came from the Renegades who raided CSA forts. They created propaganda against Omega and the leadership that CSA had, and they tried to get people to defect. They demanded Omega step down. Lots of things that were very annoying, but as I said, there's nothing they really could do. So what they were, in the end, was a nuisance. A nuisance that did end up going away over the course of 2014. Many of the Jacksonians realized that their cause was essentially futile. Omega wasn't like the other leaders who had given their posts away after a couple of months because they didn't really care. He was pretty devoted, and what that meant was that they realized they couldn't get their way just by saying, "Oh, we're going to revolt against you." So, with that, the Southern Renegades and the Jacksonian Party slowly devolved into essentially nothing, and the resistance against Omega was gone. But, of course, we're only in mid-2014. There's certainly a lot left to go. So, in late 2014, a little bit further down the line, a flower war was started with revolutionary Mexico. Pretty much entirely offensive for CSA. RM didn't have much of a chance. We were a bigger group, more skilled. That's just the way it was. So, in order to help them win those battles, RM enlisted the help of the Federal States of America. That's another union group that we regularly fought against in older CSA times. And that even went a little bit later because I fought against FSA on multiple occasions. I joined in 2012 and was somewhat active through a couple of years and didn't really get active until 2015 full time. But I definitely did fight them, so they were around for a while longer than this is happening in 2014, but not a lot longer. But either way, RM enlisted their help to fight us, and strangely, this is confusing to me. As I read through the notes that I had taken for this, it just is very interesting that this happened. RM enlisted their help and then didn't fight with them because they just surrendered right after. So they ended the war, surrendered, and that was it. But I suppose after that war, due to the loss, a man named MEX42, MEX42, separated from RM to create his own group. Also one you might know about, still around today, although certainly not living up to former glories, or at least attempts at glory. Federal Mexico. This led to RM ended up allying with CSA in order to help us against our fight with FSA, and then we in turn helped them in their fight with FM, because RM obviously saw FM as a heresy, just as we see other Confederate groups and now British groups as heresies. And that's really what happens when a group becomes established. CSA became established, and because of that, other groups that were created just didn't have the time to grow up to our size before they inevitably shut down because of bad leadership. And what that meant is that we were really the only stable Confederate group for a long time. And of course, at the time we were banned, we were the biggest Confederate group and the most active. But this isn't the time we were banned. This is before our activities skyrocketed. And at this point, we are gaining members a little bit more quickly. Roblox has gotten bigger. The group is much, obviously, better led now. And so our activity has begun to grow a little bit more and more and more and more. But still weren't at the point we are today, and we had to still manage to solidify ourselves as the CSA group. RM had done much of the same. They were not as big as us, and I wouldn't say they were solidified as the Mexican group. But there just is not, it's really a niche genre. There's not a lot of revolutionary Mexican groups. And so they had solidified themselves in our genre, the fighting that we did with certain groups that we knew. And FM was a heresy to them, and so we recognized that and we began to help them. And it's created, as you probably could guess, a very long-lasting alliance that it now even goes until today, where we are allied with RM and have been for a long time, and it's obviously a very happy union. So obviously that's turned out well for us, and I think it's been great. But it's not always been like that, because as I said, it all started with a war with RM. How things change is crazy to me. CSA has been through so much interesting history. And really, I didn't do a deep dive into this. I wanted to do a deep dive long podcast, but the more I thought about it, I was like, I want people to be able to watch this and get a review of CSA without taking too much time. I don't want this to be 3 or 4 hours of, here's what this guy said on the forum, and then here's what this guy responded with, and then this guy, every time there was an issue. I want to do the basics. But anyway, to continue on a little further, 2015 was essentially a normal year for CSA as well. One important detail that I should note, because I do want to give these people credit where credit is due. Fireman and Cool Rolling Stones both returned, apologized for their previous actions, and Fireman actually even joined CSA and was given the rank of retired officer, which I think was a good decision. Despite the fact that he had been anti-Omega, he was allowed back in, given a rank and position that recognized him as someone who used to be in power. Obviously didn't come back to the group, so there was no issues with him. And it made Omega look good, and Fireman also was able to voice his support for Omega afterwards. This was really the very end of any anti-CSA sentiment. Fireman, who had been really, along with Boom, one of the major anti-Omegas, Fire was really the top anti-Omega. Now that he had submitted, it really was all downhill from there for anyone who was not for Omega. And at this point, I don't know if there's anyone in CSA who harbors any feelings that Omega is not the best leader of the group ever and was the best choice at the time. I would be hard-pressed to find anyone who's even been around that long anymore anyway. But nevertheless, I digress. I'm talking about this and probably really doesn't matter. But I think it's interesting to point out that they have this whole drama, this whole soap opera style thing, lying about each other, fighting each other in the background, political debates and political infighting. Finally, rebellion began, and then just as the war was about to break out between the Jacksonians and the coalitionists, Irish retired and gave it to Omega. Omega begins this great dynasty that he's starting, and then just within a year or two, people immediately from the beginning begin to start up the ideas of rebellion. The sentiments are there, but then the rebels come up and essentially are put down pretty quickly. But it's just a very interesting thing. I love the history of CSA. It's very fun. But to continue on, so I don't take too much time, the anti-Omega sentiment ended there. and allowed us to continue into fighting unions and other groups instead of having infighting that was going on before. Because of that, in 2015, Omega purchased the Federal Army. Now, I assume all of you listening will know what TFA is. They were one of our main enemies, probably our main enemy ever. The person Omega purchased it from at the first time was SWAT Sniper, and this really improved CSA's activity in 2015 because there was an enemy who they were able to regularly raid. Due to the fact that CSA won numerous raids in this time span, however, TFA began to make their forts more and more unfair, which destroyed CSA's ability to raid and threw the Union into periods of inactivity. Now, this is something that I really want to get into, because I understand there's probably not as much anti-TFA sentiment now as there was in the past. We're not really associated anymore, we're not a CSA, first of all, and secondly, they've got their own community, their own thing. And I'm not going to talk about that here, I don't want to get into any of that. But the fact of the matter is, we owned TFA and set it into a period of activity. But Omega didn't want to run two groups, and so he gave TFA away. Unfortunately, every leader that TFA has had has historically failed again and again and again. That's just how it's been. Every leader they get either goes inactive, gives the group to some random low rank at some point because they don't want to deal with it anymore, or just goes crazy. It's happened so many times. TFA also became extremely toxic over this time, exploding in raids. In fact, there's a stream from Yuri1313. I'm sorry if I just butchered his name out. I know I've said it to him before, but I always can't pronounce it the right way. But I should say he has a stream of a raid where they exploited the flags in a flag capture raid, and then claimed that it wasn't them. They make fun of us now for claiming that the flags were rigged, even though there's a video of the fact that it happened. They exploited during raids. They were toxic when they random raided us and when we did them. It became a very rough relationship with TFA over their course of terrible leaders, and eventually led to them leaving the community altogether. The specific reason for their leaving really was a lot of things, and what they might say would probably be different than what I'm going to say. What I'm telling you is the truth. I was there for this. TFA may say something different, and the fact is, that doesn't matter. The Union could not beat CSA. We had a multi-year winning streak. We did not lose TFA for years. Because of the fact that they couldn't win, they didn't want to continue using our tech. They decided that it would be better to get other guns that they could practice with because they thought it was unfair. We had our own tech. This obviously isn't compatible, even though we attempted to make it compatible. In fact, we allowed them a raid where we used our tech and they used theirs. Obviously, we won this. Our tech isn't made to be slow and, quote, realistic, even though it's not really. Our tech is made to be more fast-paced and fit for a video game. Of course we're going to beat them. We also did a raid where they claimed that our fort was unfair when they random raided us. And so, because you had to capture the fort and get a certain amount of kills was really what won you the raid, was the kills, we agreed to let them start as the CSA team in our fort, and we would start as the raiders at the raider fort. Unsurprisingly, we crushed them because it wasn't that we were rigging it, unlike they claimed, although they did rig several raids, which we had to call off and claim a draw because we obviously couldn't win, but they didn't either because they rigged it. But in that raid where we let them start in our fort, we managed to beat them pretty handily because that's what CSA did. Because of the fact that TFA couldn't win, even with their own tech, because it was just unfair. The community was just not compatible anymore. TFA was not compatible with CSA. And this isn't because it was impossible to be. If TFA would have submitted to what we were doing, they'd probably still be an active Union group today that we would be fighting. But they couldn't do that, and so they left. And that was it. Now the difference is that CSA managed to thrive from this. We have two allies that we had, Revolutionary Mexico, and of course the Army of the French Empire, who we began doing raids with, where we would just randomize the teams as we do today. For TFA, however, this created a period of years of inactivity, switching leaders, where we tried to ally with them again, and then had to stop again because they were toxic. It just always happens the same way. Eventually, that led to the creation of the community Victoria, which TFA is the leader of, and that is where they are today. And that's all I'll talk about with Victoria. I don't really want to get into that. I'm sure they don't even agree with me saying that TFA is the leader of it. So I would just tell you that if you want to learn about Victoria, I'm certain someone in the Discord can make you more aware of that, but most of us at this point, and in TFA I believe they have a lot of the same sentiment, we just want to be done. TFA has caused us problems, we've had low ranks that have caused them problems. At this point, it would just be best to be done. So, because of that, I'm going to move on to the next event in CSA's history that really stands out. To give you a little bit of backstory before we get to it, after no longer allying with TFA, there were several groups that we tried to go through with allies. We had our own union group that we owned and began to run, but there's just no one to lead it. No CSA officer wanted to leave and go take over a union group, and no one that we trusted that wasn't CSA to lead a group did well. They simply failed again and again and again. So we eventually got into our swing of things. We began to slowly work our way up the ranks in terms of how many people were in our group. We became one of the largest, and then the largest Confederate group on Roblox. Our activity was unprecedented. I don't think you could find another group, at least in the Civil War genre, that brought the amount of people we did, even when we were still CSA. Which leads us up to 2019. We had several years of stability, not only stability, of massive growth. And then CSA got banned. Now, before I talk about the ban of CSA, there's one really important part of our history that I should mention. And it's a depressing part of the history, because really, if I try and imagine where we would be now without it, I think we would have been much better off in CSA. Although I don't suppose it would change much for how EBI is now. The thing that I'm talking about is CSA's mass exile. A lot of you probably don't know about this. This really isn't something we promote because there's no reason to talk about it. But in February of 2016, two major generals, Fire Invictus and TSOD, TSOD, began to mass exile almost everyone in the group. At this point, we were almost around 2,000 members. That's a lot of people. 2016 for 2,000 members was very impressive. The growth that Omega had had in that short time was awesome. But, unfortunately, all of that was lost, because those two members alone in a single night managed to remove everyone but about 10 members from EBI, including myself. Although, I will admit, at that point in 2016, I was not as active as maybe I should have been, and I did not notice for a period longer than I probably should have taken. But I was mass exiled, and I did rejoin, thankfully, eventually, and got to where I am today. But to get on to the actual event, the two had received Major General and had, I guess, some of the last lingering anti-Omega sentiments that existed in CSA, and they continued and proceeded to mass exile nearly everyone. That's as simple as it is. There's really not much else to say. Those two were removed, obviously, as Omega was still the leader. He removed them as soon as he saw the next morning, and we began the slow build back up to where we were and where we got to. Luckily, this wasn't as hard as it would have been to start from scratch with a new group, because a lot of people were confused and tried to rejoin. Of course, we've always had a very active and capable officer corps, and many of them, all of them, rejoined and were able to continue hosting trainings, and we got back to where we were, but it took us a long time. We started from 10 members. We started from scratch again, even if we did have a little bit of help. But we did. And then we get into the ban. Now, CSA was banned in December of 2019. It was very sad. Many of us were more annoyed than sad at the time, because CSA had been banned before. Roblox has obviously made it clear in the past that they don't like Confederate groups. Eventually, they banned the Confederate battle flag, which we had used, and then we switched to use the Confederate national flag, which a moderator from Roblox came and reviewed and gave us the all good. So we thought we weren't breaking the rules, and we still don't know if that was it. But before I get into the reasons for the ban, because this is an issue I could talk about at length, I want to tell you what we had beforehand. So as I said, we were banned in December of 2019. That is also right next to CSA's, I think December 8th, I could be a day or two off, is the 10th anniversary of CSA. In fact, I'm going to verify that right now because I want to see if I can find the actual date. 9th of July 2020 was EBI. So I'm not entirely sure what date we were created. I think it was, yes, 10th of December 2009. Alright, I'm sorry that took me a long time to find. I didn't have that written down, and I probably should have just to verify. But the 10th of December 2009 is the day that CSA was created. So obviously, the 10th of December 2019, we still had CSA, and we were just celebrating our 10th anniversary. A couple days before that, we were also just celebrating our 8,000th member. That was insane. That's crazy to imagine that we had 8,000 members. We were by far and away the biggest Confederate group, at least the biggest non-botted Confederate group or ad spanned. And not even close, we were the most active. No one else was even close to us in terms of Confederate groups. So, obviously doing very well. A golden era of CSA, if there ever was one, was the time after we lost TFA and began to grow extremely quickly within our community, the Richmond Pact, which we are in with RM and AFE. But on December, I believe it was December 22nd, I often don't think about this very much because it makes me sad. Obviously, I understand it is just a Roblox group, but obviously I've been in the group for a long time, since 2012, and then active since 2015 and 2016. I was a little worried for if I would still talk to everyone in the group, and so I was very sad. But, as I clarified, most people in CSA were more just annoyed at the beginning. CSA had been banned in the past, as I said. So what we assumed was that it would be like every other time. We would get banned, we would make an appeal, they would allow us to come back if we changed a certain thing or a certain couple of things, and we would be fine. But that didn't happen. Now, we did appeal. Omega appealed very quickly. They took a long time to get back to him, but essentially told him, we're sorry, the ban is legitimate, and it won't be repealed. But we thought, you know what, we're going to keep trying, we're not going to give up yet. And so he appealed again, and again, and again, and again. And eventually the replies came later, or they became more hostile. In fact, we got in touch with someone claiming to be the head of appeals at Roblox, who essentially told us that because our group was racist, we were banned. Because Omega was racist, he was banned. But the fact is, we don't know why we were banned. Because, first of all, group ban messages aren't even a thing, so we couldn't have known. But even if they were, Roblox also banned Omega's account. And so he couldn't even go on there to check what the group was banned for if it was possible, because they banned them at the same time. What he was banned for, I'm pretty sure, was just harassment, is what they've stated, which is absurd, because we didn't harass anyone. And that's why I want to really quickly cover, for anyone that watches this in the future and may be interested because you're in EBI and you want to see how CSA was and why it was banned, CSA was not deserving of a ban. The only reason CSA was banned, the only legitimate reason that I can think of, is that Roblox just didn't want Confederate groups anymore. This is further shown by the fact that Victoria, the community I talked about earlier, had a group called CSM, the Confederate States Military, who was also banned relatively quickly after CSA for essentially no reason. Now, some people made accusations of what it could have been. They said, oh, well, you used the battle flag. Or you used the Confederate flag, I should say, because Roblox said the Confederate flag was banned. But it's as I stated earlier. When battle flag was banned, we changed to the Confederate national flag, and an administrator visited our fort and verified that it was within the rules. So obviously, they didn't change the rules with them, and so either their understanding of their own rules changed and they didn't tell anyone, or that's not why. Of course, it wasn't because of harassment. Being a Confederate group, you're going to attract those that you may not want in the group, those who may act in a way that's not becoming of members of the group that we have on Roblox, but we dealt with them. We removed them, and every group has that. Even random front page games have trolls that go there and say terrible things. If all of them got banned because of their trolls, then there would be no groups on Roblox. That's not how it works. So that's not it. The only reason I can think of is because Roblox just did not like Confederate groups, and they wanted to be done with us. But we appealed for a long, long, long time. We appealed on Roblox. Omega appealed through Roblox. I appealed through Roblox for Omega, as did pretty much every other CSA officer. They essentially told all of us, sorry, you can't appeal for a friend, and they told Omega, sorry, you can't appeal, you're a racist. And then we began to appeal in other ways. Omega made a Twitter. I used mine to continuously message Roblox devs on their Twitter. Not each time, multiple times for each person. I didn't want to be an annoyance, but I did message multiple of them once and say, hey, we were unfairly banned. Could you do anything? Of course, none responded. I messaged every Roblox admin I could find on their Roblox account. None of them responded or even signified that they checked the letters that they received. And finally, I even contacted some of them on LinkedIn, which, in hindsight, was a little strange, but I was very angry. The reason for that is because for a lot of you, I'm sure, EBI, now that it's that, is fun. It's a fun group to go to, and it's fun to be involved with a community that's active every day. But for me, I am good friends with most of the officers of this group. We have known each other since 2016 or a little bit later. We talk nearly nightly in Discord calls. I've even met Omega and Blair in real life. I mean, I'm friends with these people. So the idea that because Roblox didn't like us, I wasn't going to be able to play games with anymore was really annoying. And we did stay together through the ban. We all played in the Discord, no one left. But the fact was that if we didn't have a group, eventually we were going to peter out and not play games together or come to Roblox events together because there just was no point. Now, I stayed because I was hopeful for CSA to come back, and then, after I realized that wasn't happening within a couple of months, I was hopeful that we would make another group. Many people thought that no group was coming, and they just stayed to talk with those who they had been friends with for a long time, but eventually we did get the plan to make the British group, which I'll get into in a little bit. But before that, I just want to talk a little bit more about CSA before and during the ban. As I said, CSA got banned in December. We had about a 7-month period until we made our new group. So you might be asking, what did you even do during that time? Well, the fact is we did much of the same. We often played games together after trainings or things along those lines. So what we would do is go and play those games just during training time, or we'd hang out and play non-Roblox games. That was what we did a lot of the time. Or sometimes a lot of people even joined RM or AFE. I know several officers went and became enlisted there and were probably going to earn their way up in those to join the officer corps of those groups, if that was what was necessary if CSA didn't return. For me, I didn't really have much time into Roblox at this point. I realized that as someone who's 18, nope, I'm 19 now, that's hard to think about. I probably don't fit the demographic of most Roblox players. CSA is really all that tied me to Roblox, and so I figured that I would play until everyone got bored. I didn't want to leave everyone, but I would play until everyone got bored, and then as it petered out, I would leave Roblox entirely, and then I would leave the Discord, and I'd go on with my life. Of course, very sad, but, I mean, it's not something you can stop living over, so I was sad, and I figured I'd be done. But I stayed for a little bit longer just because I wanted to see it through when everyone was finished. And luckily, I managed to get back into EBI after it was created. But so, when you think of the time that CSA was banned, think of very annoyed people who became very sad when they realized that CSA wasn't going to come back. But also, don't think that any of us lost hope. We kept trying. If any of you thought that we weren't dedicated because you didn't see us when we were in CSA and know how long we've served, just remember, the officers of this group, even the ones that are newer, but specifically the ones that were there before the ban, have been dedicated to this group in CSA, in EBI, and in a 7-month period where we didn't even know if we were going to have a group again. I know that's not really that important to talk about, but I just wanted to clarify and commend the officers of the group for staying for so long, because I think it was a really great thing to do. Now, I said I wasn't going to talk about Victoria, and I don't really want to get into Victoria's slander, but one of the other things we did face in that time period was people leaving. There were some officers that weren't loyal to the cause. Many of them left for other communities, and simply joining another community, I don't know if I understand calling someone out for joining a community. The reason we call people out for joining those communities is because those communities strongly dislike us and convince people that we are bad or that we are in the wrong. And that happened to multiple people. They were convinced of that because of the people they talked to. And we eventually lost several officers who I enjoyed the company of, some who I did not enjoy the company of, and, well, less of the officers, more of the low ranks who I didn't enjoy the company of. I liked the officers. And we lost them anyway because they were manipulated or they think we manipulated them. Like I said, I don't need to get into all of that. But what I should say is that I brought up that people stayed to tell you that I commended them, and so you should know they were dedicated. I bring this up to tell you that everything you hear about CSA or EBI probably isn't true. A lot of it is probably said by people who have a 10, 9, 8, 7, 6-year feud that has gone on with us because they dislike us, because we did better than them, and they've made up stories to make themselves feel better about what actually happened. And I'm not going to call anyone specifically out. I think that is better said in other places at other times. And I'm not saying you should never join other communities. But when you hear something about EBI, just make sure you fact check it before you decide to leave our group and go to another one because you think that we're so evil. But that may just be a little bit of bitter Necros talk that I've had saved up for a while to talk about in something like this. So let's move on to something a little bit happier. And that is the creation of EBI, the Empire of the British Isles. When Omega decided that we were going to make a new group, we were all fairly confident it couldn't be CSA. It just didn't make sense. We didn't know why we had been banned, and so even if we made a new CSA and didn't use the national flag, who knows if we'd just get banned again because we were a CSA group. So it just wasn't safe. There was no point. So it wasn't a CSA. Obviously, we're not going to be the Union. That's who we fought. Can't be France. We've already got one of them. Can't be Mexico. Got one of them. And while there was, of course, a lot of European countries that we could have been, I think most everyone agreed relatively quickly when it was suggested that Britain was probably the best option. There is a rich history. There is a well-structured government that we could already fall into that makes a little more sense to have a monarch in a Roblox group than it does to have a president who is elected, because that certainly was not what happened with us. But most of all, most of us just liked the idea. We liked British groups, we liked British history. I miss CSA, I still wish we were CSA, but the best second I can imagine is Britain. And so we decided to move over. Omega made the Empire of the British Isles group on... I don't actually know the date that it was created. I know that I think it was the 9th of July 2020. I can't remember if that's the date that we opened or that's the day that we were created. For the sake of this podcast, I'll just say it's the day that we started because that's ambiguous enough to mean either. But the group was fairly full fairly quickly, is what I should say. I would like to point out and brag that I was the third person to get into the new EBI group, and I would also like to call out Dr. Hunter Crow for being the second and beating me there, which is infuriating. Not actually, I don't actually care that much, but I still wish I had been first. But it's not that big of a deal. Anyway, we joined EBI, the officer corps joined, and eventually as we were all there and settled into the ranks and we realized that it was going to be starting back up, the other low ranks began to send requests, and once we opened, I should say, sorry I misspoke, the numbers began to grow like mad. We hit 1,000 so quickly it was like the snap of a finger. It was insane. And then 2,000 and 3,000 and 4,000 and 5,000, 10,000, 15,000. It's grown like crazy. We had a 7-month gap. We had CSA for 10 years. We had 2,000 members, got exiled down to 10, and then 8,000 members. Most of them are probably the same, but let's just say they weren't. Let's say they were completely different, and that we, if not mass exile, would have had 10,000 people in CSA. That's an impressive number for a Roblox group. Most war groups will never hit that. But that's not even half of what we've made in EBI in less than a year. We were made in July. That's a 7-month gap from our ban. Currently, as I'm recording this, and it'll probably be uploaded the day of, because I've gone over into midnight, so it'll probably be uploaded before I go to bed. We are on the now 8th of March, 2021. We were made in July 2020, so it's not been a year yet, and we are at 26,000 members. Specifically, 26,034. That is absolutely crazy. But nothing makes me happier than seeing the fact that that is the case. Seeing the fact that we have a lot of dedicated enlisted men. The officers, of course, are dedicated as well. But I've already commended them, so now I'll use this chance to commend the enlisted ranks who have stayed with us over the course of our switch from CSA. Many of them are still there from CSA and are now in EBI. I'm very appreciative of the low ranks that we have, and even the new ones who have joined and just become incredibly active. And I hope that all of you are starting on the path or are already on the path to officership, because I'm very appreciative of the dedication that we've received. Now, one thing that I didn't talk about during the CSA part of this discussion, but that I'm going to throw back to CSA now and then tie it in, is branch service. Now, I don't have all of the branches and their creation dates memorized by heart. I just don't know it. Pardon me really quickly, I'm going to take a sip of water. You may not believe it, but talking this much actually can make your throat feel kind of dry. I do, however, know the date for the sharpshooters of the Confederate States Army. So there were multiple different branches over time for CSA. There was the Marines, which I was a part of. The Marines were essentially useless. As much as I loved them, they had cool red chevrons on their uniform. They essentially had no use. And because of that, they were shut down fairly early on in my career. And there was also the cavalry, which was gold facings and collars, can't remember the word. And they were always a very, very popular group, but unfortunately disbanded as it just became not very effective to use horses with the way that we played. The map that we were on didn't really work well with them, and so we disbanded them and didn't have them. And that led us into our three major branches that we've had since, I would say 2016 is when we got all three of them regularly. The Confederate States Artillery, the Confederate States Medics, and the Confederate States Sharpshooters. I assume that they're all pretty similar. I think Artillery was a really old branch that got disbanded and then came back in later CSA. So I'm not gonna assume about Medics and Artillery because I don't know their dates. For CSA Sharpshooters, I know that was 24th of January 2016, and so we've been around for a long time, and I've been in them since originally since the beginning. Not since they were very first created, but since I left the Marines, that's when I joined. And so we had these three branches, and right now there's no members in them. Only officers remain in the Sharpshooters group. Unfortunately, but I also realize there's no really reason to have anyone in there. I don't remember how many officers we had whenever CSA was banned. It wasn't even 1,000. It was probably 700 or 800, which I was very happy with. Sharpshooters had the most members. It was one of the most active branches, and I was very proud of that. But to make a comparison to you, EBI was created on 9th of July, or started on 9th of July, as well as the Rifle Brigade. This time we had all of our three main branches already created before the group began. So we have the Imperial Rifle Regiment, the Imperial Regiment of Artillery, and I'm going to mispronounce the medics unless I verify it right now, which is the Imperial Medical Department. That's what it is. All three of them are over 1,500 members. And in fact, Rifles and Artillery are both over 2,000 members, with medics not far behind. So just take a moment and consider that. CSA had been around for 10 years. And maybe not all the branches, they haven't been around that long, but for a long time either way. Especially, the group was already bigger when we created them, so more people would have seen them. And they never even reached 1,000 members. The branches for EBI, however, have hit 1,000 members. They hit 1,000 members within a couple of days. 2,000 is what we're counting up to now for medics still, and now it's on the path to 3,000 for Artillery and Sharpshooter and Rifles, who just hit that mark. It's crazy. So 26,000 members in the main group. Almost 2,000 for every branch. Not only that, we're also starting a government. I told you a long time ago in this podcast, right at the beginning, or very close to it, that the Coalitionist Senate was started in the Riboy era. It died out in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, or more 4th, 5th, and 6th eras of CSA. And then it came back under Omega to have a position of power. And it transferred over to EBI. The way it transferred, as I said, was the Privy Council. But that's all the government we had in CSA. There was no reason to have anything else. We just had the, quote, Senate, which didn't really have any bills other than a couple. I mean, maybe a few that got presented over the years. And like I said, it still is all decided by Omega. And it's still going to be. That's how it's going to work. But it makes sense now, because here's how the government is going to work. And I'm not going to explain to you the elections and all of that. We haven't gone into that yet anyway. But what I will tell you is that we are going to have an Imperial Parliament. We are going to allow enlisted men to be elected into that Parliament, as well as officers. We'll just decide the training days for officers in the Discord. We're not going to have that as a government thing anymore. And what we are going to have is bills. And they don't have to be effective. What I was worried about in CSA was, why would we make bills if we don't have a real government? There's no point in role-playing bills. We're just making stuff for the effective use and leadership of CSA. But now this is a role-play government. We can make bills to whatever we want. It's just a separate faction of the group. It's just a separate part of the army. So not only have we created a new group that in less than a year has over doubled what we used to have. Not only have we created 3 new branches that within less than a year have over doubled what we had in our old branches. We have also managed to set up and get ready to begin an entire system of government for this group. Something that we've never done before, and that really is not often done. An army and a government group being well run together is unheard of. I'm just doting on EBI now, and I'm going to do that forever if I don't rein myself in. And so what I'm going to say as I close up is this. EBI, let me say this to you like I've heard many speeches given by state governors over the time, and even the president at the State of the Union. Ladies and gentlemen, the state of the Empire is very good. That is the truth of the matter. We are in a better spot than we have ever been in, and that's not even close. CSA was an amazing group. I miss it every day. When I come on, I still wish I could be in my awesome gray general uniform. But the fact is, we've moved to another group. We have a very effective and active membership, a very effective and active officer corps, and we have, of course, an effective leader, and a group that I believe we can set up to run into the future for a long time as a successful Roblox war group and can grow even more. It's not like our growth has stagnated. We're continuously growing quicker and quicker. We don't even run ads anymore. We used to run ads for CSA, and at this point, we just allow our massive size to attract people to us. So as I said, CSA was a great group. I miss it every day, but we're in EBI now. And the state of the Empire is very good. Covering the history of CSA has been something I thought was a really good idea for a long time. And what better time to cover the history of CSA than when there's no more history to be made? There are obviously many things that I missed, and I'm sure that after I upload this video, anyone who listens is going to tell me about things that I missed. But the fact is, the goal of this video was not to be a historian. I just wanted to cover the basics of what we did, what we went through, what we experienced, so that maybe 5 years down the line, when all of us officers and generals have retired and a whole new batch of people are running the group, maybe they'll watch this and figure something out that they didn't know. Maybe I can inspire a little bit of group nationalism in them, and I will certainly be happier for that. So as I close, if you listen to this podcast, I want to say thank you very much. I intend to do more. Some of the ideas I've had are multiple interviews with EBI officers, specifically those who've been around for a long time, to get their opinions on how things have changed, what the new group has been like, what the switch was like, what the ban was like, things like that. Specifically, probably hear from Omega, people like Astral, maybe Assassin, but others as well. I thought maybe about doing coverage of the branches, one podcast where we split it up into 3 sections of the podcast. We have the commander and the deputy commander of each branch tell you a little bit about what they do, about what you should expect. Maybe if you listen to it, you can be convinced of a group that you wanted to join if you weren't already. And finally, and most excitingly, something I really want to do, is I think we're going to try and do the Imperial British podcast also as the officiators of the first Prime Minister debate for the EBI government. So once we've elected all of our representatives and the Prime Ministers to be elected from those, obviously we'll have a couple of people front-runners for that position. And as the elections draw near, I would like to host debates in a group Discord call where we can have everyone be chance to be allowed to give their opinion and to hear a debate live, maybe even stream it, although that may not be a good idea. Maybe just put a video out, actually. The problem is I'm also probably going to run as a candidate, and so maybe have someone like Omega or someone who's not running officiate in the sense of actually asking the questions, but at least I would be publishing it on the channel and recording it and things along those lines, which I think would be very, very interesting, and hopefully you guys would enjoy it as well. So those are the things you have to look forward to. I look forward to making this again. It's been very fun to sit down and think about all of this. It's been fun to look back as well and to reminisce. So, I believe that's all I have. This has been the second episode of the Imperial British Podcast, specifically covering the history of CSA and EBI. And I hope that in a couple of years there's a lot more history to be recorded that I don't know yet, and I hope that it's all good. I hope we have a golden age for the time until Roblox shuts down, but that's all to be seen. Maybe I'll make another podcast in the future. That's it from me. Please tune in for episode 3 if you can. I hope it will be just as interesting as this one. I hope you find this one interesting. The Imperial British Podcast is now finished with episode 2.